Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiasts. Welcome back to the deep dive where we grapple with those big head-scratching ideas that keep us pondering, especially those of us with a philosophical bent, you know what I mean? Tonight, we are going deep, deep into the fascinating world of moral naturalism.
Yeah, it's a really fundamental question, isn't it? Like, what is the very essence of morality? Moral naturalism, it proposes that moral facts are at their heart natural facts. It's like saying that morality isn't this, separate ethereal thing, but rather it's woven into the fabric of the natural world. This idea it stems from moral realism.
Right, moral realism.
Yeah,
That's the understanding that moral truths exist out there objectively, independent of our own personal opinions or beliefs. And for this deep dive, we're turning to a pretty comprehensive source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on moral naturalism. At first glance, this might seem like a pretty straightforward concept. But hold on tight, because as any good philosopher knows, things are rarely that simple, right? Turns out that actually defining and defending this seemingly simple claim, well, it gets seriously complex, and it's a super hotly debated topic in contemporary philosophy.
totally. It's not like a settled issue. There are metaethicists out there right now who are wrestling with all the nuances of what it even means for a moral fact to be a natural fact, and then whether this view can really hold up under serious scrutiny. So our goal in this deep dive is to unpack all that complexity for you, our listeners, so you can, really get a good grasp of this really significant idea in metaethics.
All right, so fellow philosophers, where do we even begin with all of this? I think a good starting point is, well, to clearly understand what moral naturalism even is, and how it relates to all the other viewpoints in metaethics, we've got to set the stage, so to speak.
Absolutely. So at its core, moral naturalism is built on a few key commitments. As we mentioned, there's moral realism, the idea that moral facts exist out there objectively, independent of any specific viewpoint. They're just there.
And then we have fact naturalism, which basically says that these moral facts, these objective ones, are ultimately natural facts. It's like they're part of the natural order of things. And then, closely related to that, is property naturalism, which says that the moral properties themselves, like goodness or justice, are also natural properties. And this might sound a bit technical, but as a fellow philosopher, I think you'll appreciate this nuance. Are we talking about all moral facts out there, or are we specifically talking about the properties that make up those facts? There's a subtle difference there, right?
Yeah, super important distinction. Let's take, for example, a specific moral fact, like helping someone in need is good. That fact, it basically shows the moral property of goodness in action. Now, if fact naturalism is true, then all those specific moral facts, they're natural facts too. But property naturalism, it takes it a step further. It says that the property of goodness itself is a natural property. But hold on, not all moral truths are about those specific instances, right? Like general moral principles, things like justice is important, those might hold true even if, perfect justice is never fully achieved in the real world. So while property naturalism says that the building blocks of morality, they're natural, it doesn't automatically mean that all moral principles can be like neatly reduced to natural facts in some straightforward way.
That's a really crucial nuance for any philosopher who's, really trying to get a handle on this. So when we use the word natural here, in this whole philosophical context, what are we really talking about? It's not like just some casual observation about how humans behave, is it?
Right, definitely not. In moral naturalism, natural usually points to those types of facts and properties that are like the domain of scientific inquiry. It's all about putting morality within the framework of that naturalistic worldview that comes from, well, empirical science.
Yeah.
The idea that we can ultimately understand the universe and everything in it through science.
Okay, so if moral naturalism wants to kind of fit morality into our scientific view of the world, then what are some of the other viewpoints that, as philosophers, we might consider? What are the alternatives?
So there are several key alternatives out there. You have moral supernaturalism, which says that morality, its foundation, is something, transcendent or divine, like comes from a higher power. Then there's moral non-naturalism, famously championed by G.E. Moore, which argues that moral properties are this, well, unique type of property, totally different from both natural and supernatural properties. And then you have this whole spectrum of anti-realist views, things like constructivism, relativism, expressivism, and error theory. Those offer different perspectives.
What's interesting is that a lot of those anti-realists, they often take a broadly naturalistic approach when they explain morality, don't they? It's like they're using naturalism as a tool, but not the whole picture.
Oh, absolutely. Many anti-realists try to explain, like, Our moral beliefs and our practices in naturalistic terms, maybe through ideas like social conditioning or emotional responses to things. But their core argument is that those stance-independent moral facts, the ones moral realists believe in, well, those just can't fit into a purely naturalistic view of the world. They just don't see how it works. Moral naturalists, though, they believe this reconciliation is possible. They're all about bridging that gap.
Okay, so this all seems pretty well defined so far, but I remember that the Stanford entry mentioned this ongoing difficulty in pinning down exactly what natural facts are as a challenge that, any philosopher of science is going to be familiar with. It's like defining the boundaries of science itself, right?
Yeah, for sure. This whole demarcation problem, how do we clearly separate science from non-science? It creates this background challenge for defining natural facts. There's debate about whether it's about the metaphysics of natural facts, what they're made of, or if it's about how we come to know them, the epistemology. What's really interesting from a philosophical standpoint is that someone like Russ Schaefer-Lando, he can totally agree that moral facts are made of natural stuff, but still call himself a non-naturalist. Why? Because he thinks we gain moral knowledge through intuition, which he doesn't consider a scientific method. It shows just how complex this issue can be.
So it's not just about what morality is, but also about how we come to know it.
Yeah.
That adds a whole other layer of complexity to moral naturalism. It's not just one question, it's a whole bunch intertwined.
You got it. And this brings us to the whole linguistic angle of this debate. There's this tension between, analytic naturalism and methodological naturalism.
Well,
Analytic naturalism, it suggests that moral claims are basically synonymous with super complex scientific claims, meaning we could understand morality just by analyzing concepts, maybe even a priori, without needing empirical science. But methodological naturalism, that's a different beast altogether. It says that moral knowledge is gained through those same empirical methods we use in science observation, experimentation, that kind of thing.
it seems like there's this fundamental difference in how naturalists think we can grasp morality, right? Are we dissecting our concepts to find that natural core within, or are we out there in the world discovering it through experiments and observations? It's like two paths to the same destination, maybe.
Exactly. The naturalists who think we can analyze moral terms into purely scientific language, they're called, well, analytic naturalists. The ones who disagree and see a more synthetic connection between moral and natural properties, they're synthetic naturalists. This just goes to show you the diversity of thought, even within the broader moral naturalist camp. It's not a monolithic thing.
And there was this other term, grounded naturalism,
Mm.
mentioned in the Stanford entry. How does that fit in with all of this? Where does it stand?
Right. Grounded naturalism. This one proposes that every single moral fact out there, it's ultimately grounded in non-normative facts. The goal is to explain morality using terms that aren't themselves evaluative or prescriptive, getting to the root of things.
The entry pointed out that even this concept runs into some philosophical roadblocks, right?
Oh, for sure. Defining grounding is a whole philosophical project in itself, right? What does it even mean for one fact to be more fundamental than another? And then there's the whole relationship between natural facts and non-normative facts. Are they the same thing? Is one a subset of the other? It's not always clear. The funny thing is some philosophers who call themselves non-naturalists, they might totally agree that moral facts are grounded in non-normative facts. So grounded naturalism doesn't really draw this clean line between naturalism and its opponents. And like you said, trying to ground morality specifically in natural facts just takes us back to square one, defining natural facts in a philosophically sound way. It all gets very circular. It's clear that finding that natural basis for morality is a common goal. But pinning down the exact meaning, well, that's still a big debate among us philosophers. We like a good debate, right?
Okay, so we've navigated that sea of definitions, those foundational concepts. Let's move on to descriptivism and reductivism. Why are these naturalisms always popping up when we talk about moral naturalism? What makes them so relevant?
Well, I think it's because they offer potential ways of explaining how those moral facts can be natural facts, or at least they represent these related philosophical approaches that both aim to make sense of morality without resorting to, mysterious or otherworldly explanations. They try to keep it grounded.
Let's start with descriptivism. What's the main idea behind it? What are the descriptivists claiming?
Descriptivism really hinges on this distinction between normative terms, words like good, right, ought, those kinds of words, and descriptive terms, words like red, square, or causes pleasure. Those are about describing things. Moral descriptivism specifically argues that some of those descriptive terms, well, they can actually refer to moral properties too.
And how does that tie in with the whole naturalist project? How does descriptivism support the naturalists?
So, if science is mainly about describing the world, which makes sense, right? Because science wants to explain how things are then analytic naturalism. It finds a buddy in descriptivism. If moral claims are like synonyms for scientific claims and scientific claims are descriptive, then moral claims got to be descriptive too, right? This gives us a way to fit morality into our naturalistic worldview just through the meaning of the words themselves.
And for those synthetic naturalists, the connection to descriptivism is a bit different, right? It's not quite the same.
You're absolutely right. Synthetic descriptivism, it says that some descriptive terms, they refer to moral properties not by definition, but because of these like synthetic identity relations. Kind of like how water and H2O refer to the same thing, but we discovered that empirically. A synthetic naturalist could say that goodness points to a specific natural property, even if the meaning of goodness doesn't have that natural description built into it.
But the idea of naturalism being the same as descriptivism, like moral facts are natural facts because descriptivism is true, well, that seems to hit some pretty big roadblocks, doesn't it?
It does. One problem is that descriptive language can easily talk about supernatural things. So, even if all moral properties were described with descriptive words, it wouldn't necessarily mean those properties are natural. Plus, while analytic naturalism needs descriptivism to be true, the opposite isn't the case. A naturalist could believe that goodness is a natural property, even if the only way to talk about it is with the word goodness itself. It's like Jonathan Dancy's idea of one-term naturalism.
Mm.
So, naturalism doesn't live or die by descriptivism. They're not inseparable.
And even if we just focus on descriptivism, it has its own internal challenges, right? It's not like a perfect theory.
Oh, for sure. While it's super easy to point to moral properties using descriptive language, like the property Moore talked about in Principia Ethica, that's not enough for descriptivists. They need a stronger link between descriptive terms and those moral properties. Then there's the issue of those thick normative terms, words like courageous or dishonest. Those seem to mix description and evaluation, making things tricky. And lastly, there's the basic problem of defining what even is normative language versus descriptive language, doing it in a way that's clear and doesn't just assume what we're trying to prove. Depending on whether you prefer functional or referential accounts of meaning, that distinction descriptivism relies on, well, it gets blurry. It's a really complex area with lots of unsolved problems for philosophers who are, really into the relationship between language and morality.
Okay, so descriptivism is pretty complicated. Let's move on to reductivism. How does that connect to the whole moral naturalism thing? What's the link there?
Reductivism, in a nutshell, is the idea that we can reduce moral properties to some other kind of property, like break them down to more basic components. The big question is whether naturalism is basically the same as reductivism, or if reductivism is just another interesting but separate viewpoint. The main problem here is that the word reduce, it's kind of ambiguous. It can mean different things, which often leads to confusion in philosophy, right? We love our precise definitions.
Right, the Stanford entry mentioned this difference between linguistic reduction and metaphysical reduction. Can you break that down for us? What's the
Yeah.
difference?
Of course. Linguistically, reducing something means like defining a word using other words. It's basically conceptual analysis, similar to analytic naturalism or to descriptivism more broadly. The classic example is the hedonic reduction, the claim that goodness is just pleasure, where pleasure is a descriptive term that supposedly refers to a moral property.
And what about metaphysical reduction? What does that involve?
Metaphysically, reducing is about fundamentality. It's about which properties are like more basic or foundational.
Hmm.
If property A reduces to property B, then A is considered less fundamental than B. It's like A is built from B or depends on B. Now, for naturalists, this usually means that moral properties are those higher level properties that are made up of, at their core, those more fundamental physical properties that science studies. Non-naturalists, though, they might argue that some moral properties are themselves fundamental, like not built from anything else. So naturalism as reductivism in this metaphysical sense would mean that all moral properties, they can be reduced down to those non-moral physical properties that science deals with.
But there seem to be some issues with this view as well, right? It's not without its problems.
hmm Exactly. Think about it. Supernatural properties can also be reduced to other supernatural properties. So just because something reduces doesn't automatically mean it's natural. We'd need to specify reductive naturalism, meaning moral properties reduce specifically to natural properties, which of course means we need a clear definition of natural, and we've already seen how tricky that can be. Plus, there are these like internal inconsistencies within the concept of metaphysical reduction itself. It's not as straightforward as it might seem at first glance.
Like that conflict between the fundamentality platitude and the identity platitude that the entry mentioned, that's where things get a bit naughty.
Yeah, exactly. The fundamentality platitude, it basically says that if A reduces to B, then A is less fundamental than B. The identity platitude, it says that if A is identical to B, then A reduces to B. But here's the rub. Identity is a symmetrical relationship, meaning if A is identical to B, then B is identical to A. But being less fundamental than, that's asymmetrical. A can be less fundamental than B, but B can't be less fundamental than A if that's the case. So these two platitudes can clash. Let's say, for example, that rightness is identical to conducing to pleasure. So rightness would be the same as this complex property, but it would also be made of its components, making it less fundamental than them. So which one is the reduction here? Philosophers use that word to describe both situations. So reduction, it's ambiguous, both between the linguistic and metaphysical senses, and even within the metaphysical sense itself. As the Stanford entry rightly pointed out, despite all this confusion about naturalism, descriptivism, and reductivism, we philosophers, we often act like these words have this clear universal meaning that everyone agrees on. But as philosophers, we got to be aware of all the underlying complexities when we throw around these seemingly simple labels. It's all about precision, right?
Absolutely. So, having explored the complexities of defining moral naturalism and all its related concepts, let's shift gears and look at the arguments for it. What are the main reasons philosophers have given in support of this view? Let's hear the case for moral naturalism.
Okay, so the Stanford entry starts with what it calls the basic argument, which in its simplest form just follows logically from two popular philosophical ideas. First, naturalism, that big metaphysical view that everything that exists is part of the natural world. And second, moral realism, the belief that objective moral facts exist independent of our opinions. So if both of those are true, then it logically follows that moral facts must be those objective natural facts. It's a pretty straightforward argument in that sense.
And it's safe to say that both of those underlying premises, naturalism and moral realism, they hold a lot of appeal for many philosophers, right? They're not fringe ideas.
Totally. Naturalism has been super successful in helping us understand the world through science. Of course, that doesn't mean there can't be anything beyond the natural world or that science is the only way to know things. But naturalism's track record is pretty impressive, and it gives it a lot of weight in philosophy. Similarly, moral realism, it just feels right to a lot of people. We tend to think of statements like unprovoked violence is wrong as objectively true, not just matters of opinion or cultural norms. Moral realism gives philosophical backing to that gut feeling. So the basic argument for moral naturalism, it gains strength from the fact that its two main components are already pretty plausible on their own. It's building on solid ground.
Right, it's not starting from scratch. Now, the entry then goes into some more complex arguments, starting with those based on supervenience. For those listening who might not be familiar with this term, can you give us a quick explanation of what supervenience means in this context? What's it all about?
Sure. In metaethics, supervenience is this idea that you can't have two possible worlds, think hypothetically, that are exactly the same in all their natural facts, but have different moral facts. In simpler terms, it's like saying that the moral stuff of the world, it depends on and is determined by the natural stuff. So if everything's the same at the natural level, the moral stuff has to be the same too. It's like the moral facts are riding on the back of the natural facts.
Okay, I think I'm following so far. So how have philosophers used this idea of moral facts depending on natural facts to actually argue for moral naturalism? The entry mentioned a direct argument put forward by Frank Jackson. What's that all about?
Right. Jackson's direct argument, it tries to prove that moral properties are the same as natural properties by combining supervenience with intentionalism. Now, intentionalism is this view that if two properties always go hand in hand, like anything that has one must have the other, then they're actually the same property. It's like two sides of the same coin. So the argument goes something like this. Any action that's morally wrong, it's got a certain set of natural features. Because of supervenience, any other action with those exact same natural features also has to be morally wrong. So you could, in theory, come up with this super complex natural property, the property of having all the natural features of any morally wrong action. It would be a huge list. Since anything morally wrong would have this complex natural property, and anything with this property would be morally wrong, then, according to intentionalism, moral wrongness would be the same as this natural property. Boom. Wrongness is a natural property.
That's a clever argument, but the entry pointed out some possible weaknesses in its assumptions. Are those assumptions really rock solid?
Good point. One big issue is intentionalism itself. Some critics have brought up counterexamples like the properties of being triangular and being trilateral. These always go together. If it's triangular, it's trilateral, and vice versa. But many philosophers think there's still different properties, not just two words for the same thing. The argument also assumes that this, mega disjunction of natural properties, this potentially infinite list, can itself be a natural property. That's something philosophers debate too.
Fair enough. What about the explanatory argument for naturalism that uses supervenience? How does that one work?
Okay, this argument, supported by philosophers like R.M. Hare, Simon Blackburn, and Tristram Macpherson, it says that supervenience itself is this, really remarkable fact about how the natural and the moral are related. It needs explaining. Why are they so tightly linked? Moral naturalism, they argue, gives us a simple explanation. If moral facts are just natural facts, then it's no surprise that they always line up perfectly with the natural world. They're not two separate things, so they don't act separately. The challenge, then, is for non-naturalists to come up with an equally convincing explanation for this tight connection. If moral facts aren't natural facts, why are they so dependent on them?
And how have non-naturalists tried to answer that challenge? What explanations have they offered?
They've come up with various ideas, like maybe there are these fundamental moral laws that govern how the two realms are connected, or maybe there's the special normative grounding relation that links natural facts to moral facts, or even the idea of these hybrid properties that are both natural and normative at the same time. A more radical response is to question supervenience altogether. They argue that moral principles might have this kind of normative necessity that's different from metaphysical necessity. This means you could have worlds that are naturally identical but morally different. So if supervenience isn't this universal rule, then those direct and explanatory arguments for moral naturalism, they lose a lot of their power.
Interesting. The last type of argument for naturalism that the entry discussed is based on anti-skepticism. How does being a naturalist supposedly help us deal with moral skeptics? How does it make our moral beliefs more secure?
The basic idea is that if moral facts are just natural facts, then we might be able to use those tried and true methods of science to learn about them. This would, theoretically, put moral knowledge on more solid ground than if we only relied on things like intuition, which skeptics often say are unreliable or subjective. Science has a reputation for objectivity, right?
And how does naturalism tackle those explanationist challenges that try to undermine our trust in moral beliefs? Those challenges that say our moral beliefs are just products of our psychology, our culture, or evolution.
Yeah, those are tough challenges. Naturalists can respond by saying that while those factors definitely shape our moral beliefs, sometimes those natural factors are the moral facts. For example, they might say that our belief that Hitler was evil is explained by the fact that he was evil, and that evil was a natural feature of his actions and character. It wasn't just our opinion. Similarly, if goodness is tied to cooperation, then our evolved tendency to value cooperation, well, that reflects an underlying moral truth. This way, naturalists can acknowledge those influences on our thinking without saying our moral beliefs are completely disconnected from real moral truths.
Okay, so there are some strong arguments in favor of moral naturalism. But like any philosophical position, it faces objections too. Let's dive into those, starting with probably the most famous one, G.E. Moore's open question argument. That was a classic.
Ah, yes. The open question argument, it's a cornerstone of metaethics. It still sparks debate even today, despite all the criticisms and revisions it's faced. It's a testament to its impact.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with it, can you give us a quick rundown of how Moore's argument works? What's the main idea?
Okay, so Moore's argument was mainly aimed at what he called naturalistic definitions of good. Those theories that try to define goodness using some natural property, saying that statements like pleasure is good are true by definition. Moore argued that for any natural property you try to equate with goodness, the question, X is that property, but is it good, will always make sense. It'll never be a contradiction to ask that, even if you totally understand what X and that property are. Think about pleasure again. You can completely understand what pleasure is and still wonder if all pleasure is actually good. This is different from closed questions like, a bachelor is an unmarried man. We're asking X is a bachelor, but is X unmarried? Just shows you don't get what bachelor means. From this, Moore concluded that goodness can't be identical to any natural property.
But like we talked about earlier, most philosophers now think that the open question argument, it's mainly targeting a specific type of naturalism, not the whole idea itself, right? It's more focused.
Exactly. The consensus is that it's most effective against analytic descriptivism. The idea that moral terms have to refer to natural properties because of their meaning, or through analyzing those concepts. It's not seen as this knockout blow against synthetic descriptivism, where the connection between moral and natural properties is something we discover empirically, or against one-term naturalism, which, as we discuss, says there's no inherent descriptive link between moral terms and natural properties. So in a way, the open question argument, it kind of pushed naturalists to come up with those more sophisticated and tougher versions of their theory. It made them think harder.
Even as an argument against analytic descriptivism, the open question argument has faced its fair share of counter-arguments, hasn't it? It's not been universally accepted.
Definitely not. Some philosophers say it's begging the question, like it assumes what it's trying to prove, that the question X is N, but is it good, is genuinely an open question. Analytic descriptivists who really believe that pleasure just is goodness will naturally think that question is nonsense, like you just don't get the concept. Others use the paradox of analysis, saying that even a correct, insightful analysis might not be immediately obvious or feel like a closed question. The true analysis of goodness might just be complex and not jump out at us. And lastly, some say more use too few examples, that the fact some definitions of good fail doesn't mean all possible definitions fail. It's like saying all birds can't fly because penguins can't.
Okay, so moving past more, the entry then looked at the normativity and triviality objections as more modern challenges to moral naturalism. Let's tackle the normativity objection first. What's the main point there?
This one, really well explained by philosophers like Derek Parfit and T.M. Scanlon, it focuses on what many see as this, like, fundamental difference between moral facts and natural facts. Moral facts, the argument goes, are about what we should do, what matters, what we ought to value. They tell us how to act. Natural facts, on the other hand, they're just about how the world is, described without any judgment. The worry for naturalists is that by trying to make morality part of the natural world, they miss this essential oughtness of morality. They reduce it to just is.
And how have moral naturalists tried to address this challenge? It seems like a pretty serious one.
One way is to say that while moral facts usually do give us reasons to act, that reason-giving power isn't, like, built into their very nature. This often involves proposing what are sometimes called reforming definitions of morality. The focus is on describing moral facts in ways that are usually, but not always, tied to reasons or obligations. It's like loosening the connection a bit.
That seems controversial for a philosopher to say that morality might not be fundamentally about reasons or obligations. That's a big claim.
Oh, absolutely. It's a big debate. Critics say normativity is like the heart of morality. If we define moral facts in purely naturalistic terms, and those terms don't automatically have normative force for everyone, then our picture of morality, well, it might not capture why it matters for how we live. Reformers, though, they push back and ask whether our initial pre-theoretical ideas about morality are really that rigid. And they argue that even their naturalistic definitions can explain why morality matters, even if normativity isn't part of the definition itself. It's like saying morality might not always tell us what to do, but it still shapes our values and actions.
Okay, I'm seeing the nuance there. What's the other main way naturalists have responded to this normativity objection? What other strategies do they have?
The other main approach is to argue that normativity itself can be naturalized. This usually involves two steps. First, you try to define all those normative concepts using just one basic normative concept, like reason or value. Then you try to show that this basic normative concept ultimately points to a natural property or relation. It's like finding the natural root of all those oughts.
The entry gave some examples of philosophers who have tried to naturalize normativity, right? Who are some of the key figures there?
Yeah. Mark Schroeder, for example, he has this reasons first view where he defines all normative concepts using the idea of reason. He then defends this Humean theory of reasons, saying that having a reason to act basically means that action will help you get what you want, which he considers a natural psychological state. Philippa Foot, she takes a value-first approach, focusing on goodness as the basic normative concept. Using neo-Aristotelian ideas, she argues that goodness, when understood as human flourishing, is itself a natural thing because it's grounded in our natural abilities and activities.
But those attempts to naturalize normativity, they often face skepticism, especially when it comes to that second step of linking the basic normative concept to something natural, right? It's like they're trying to build a bridge between two very different worlds.
Right. Non-naturalists often insist that there's this fundamental gap between normative facts and natural facts that just can't be bridged. They see them as fundamentally different kinds of things. So trying to equate that core normative concept with a natural property, well, it just won't work, according to them. We mentioned Wittgenstein earlier, who famously felt this difference, and David Enoch also talks about this strong intuition that the two are just too different. Naturalists like Schroeder try to explain this intuition by saying that just because we don't see an obvious connection between the normative and the natural in their theory doesn't mean they're not metaphysically identical. It's like saying we might not understand how they're the same, but they could still be the same. Critics, though, often counter that this lack of a clear conceptual link might actually be stronger evidence for non-naturalism. It's an ongoing debate for sure.
And then there's Parfit's triviality objection, which is kind of related to the open question argument. What's the gist of that objection? What Parfit getting at?
Okay. Parfit argued that if moral naturalism is true, then those supposed equivalences between moral claims and their natural counterparts should be like obvious and trivial, because it basically be.